Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler podcast, where we have a real conversation about all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, and I'm joined with my co-host, Elena. In this episode, we are going to be talking about how Canadian history is boring and how to change that mindset. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. Okay, I've got a secret. When I was in school, I hated all history that happened about after the Renaissance. The closer we got to modern times, the more I hated it. I always wanted to stab somebody with a fork as soon as we got to Canadian history.
That's funny because Canadian history is my favorite.
All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about Canadian history, and I thought it was kind of amusing as growing up that I didn't like Canadian history at all, and then now here I am helping out the Canadian homeschool community, and the one thing people always ask for is Canadian history resources. So today we're going to have a little bit of chat about how to make Canadian history a little less boring and more engaging. So the first question I think I have to ask is, why do Canadians in general seem to have this perception that Canadian history is boring? I think that's a lie that so many of us believe. And for a long time, I hated Canadian history, even when I was in university taking a dedicated Canadian history course. I mean, I wanted to love it. I really did. But the way that it was given to us in school was just so boring. What do you think?
I think if it's presented in a really dry way, say a textbook, and no additional projects or resources, then it can be pretty boring. I remember in school, we used to have everyone would sit there with their textbook open and the teacher would be like, okay, Sarah, read, the first paragraph on page 89, and then she'd read, and then, okay, now John, you read the next paragraph on the, and you just do that, and you'd go around reading, and I would just be like, oh my goodness, so boring, because all these different kids' voices, and then some of the kids would struggle with reading, and that was frustrating for trying to listen, and obviously just awful for them. I mean, that was not a great idea to inflict on them, and it just wasn't interesting. Then you'd have a test, and you kind of learn the dates for the test, and you'd have to memorize what year this happened or what date or where this specific thing happened. And it would just be some fact that you would have to memorize, regurgitate for the test, and be done with. And I think that's why I found it boring when I was a kid. But when a teacher made it come a little bit more alive, if they had a project, or we read something a little more interesting, or it was approached in a different way, that's when it was engaging and interesting.
Yeah, so I have three reasons that I think Canadian history is often considered boring by Canadians. The first is what I agree with you about, that in general, it's just presented as a series of dates and facts and events that really have no meaning to us. It's just given to us as, this is what you need to know. And it's, for most people, it's kind of hard to get excited about just facts and data. I mean, for some people, maybe, but for most people, just the straight up facts and data aren't really all that engaging or interesting. The second is that Canadian history is kind of really small in comparison with the big overarching view of history that we know of. If we look at the time that history in our country has first been written down, it was probably around the 1500s, the 15th century. We've only really been a country since 1867. So how can we possibly have the engaging, deep, rich histories that we're familiar with some of the other long ancient civilizations like Egypt and Greece and those kinds of cultures and countries that have been around for a long time? And the third is that our history is pretty quiet. We don't really have any these huge, big flashbang moments like so many other countries. We don't have any revolutions. We don't have any major civil wars. We don't have any crazy rulers dancing on the walls with the city is burning, playing the violin. We don't have any secret warrior bands training in hidden courtyards, unless I missed that class, it's possible. So I think that's some of the reasons that I think Canadian history tends to be considered boring. Then the question, I guess, becomes, if we as parents and as homeschoolers are trying to teach our kids Canadian history, how can we make it fun for our kids so they don't go, Canadian history, kind of like I used to do in school with my eye rolling and wanting to grab forks. I always think that the first step is us, because if we consider Canadian history boring, guess what's going to happen? Our kids are going to be bored of Canadian history. So the first thing we need to do is a mindset shift. How do you think parents and educators can change their mindset towards Canadian history to make it enjoyable for themselves and also for their kids?
In our homeschool, I know that I have, out of my kids, I mean, my youngest, we haven't really done any history, very little still, but my older kids, we did history. And out of the three older kids, one of them really doesn't enjoy it. The other two love it. So I love it. So does my husband. So I think part of it is personality sometimes, but I know that for us, we always included a lot of historical fiction, a lot of handing it to the children that could read it, or even better, read aloud so we could, discuss it using some of those resources that are available. Forget that author has a whole series. Is it Richard Livesay? Maybe you pronounce his name like that. That has a whole series. We enjoyed some of those, especially for the hands-on projects in it, or some of the books by Barbara Greenwood that had Canadian history stuff, and then they had hands-on projects. So those kinds of things were more interesting, as well as using some videos from time to time. My one child that really doesn't like history has never taken to the read alouds and really does not like watching anything on a screen. So I think you kind of have to cater it to, if your child does better with learning through video, then using that a lot. If your child does better with listening to read alouds, using that a lot. Kind of trying to make it interesting through using something that engages them.
Yeah. And if you're like me and growing up at school, you didn't like Canadian history at all, I think the first thing that you need to do is stop thinking of Canadian or history in general. Stop thinking of it as just dates, numbers, and facts. It's not just a series of events that happened. It's about the history is actually the story of people's lives and experiences. And when we think of it that way, it can make it less boring and more relatable. So that's helpful. And as you said, historical fiction is one way that can really help with that. And I know we've talked a bit about that. One of the reasons is because it really gets you emotionally connected to the character as they live and experience a time period or a time period or event, not a fact, an event. And it takes that boring fact and it makes it real. So that can be really helpful. As an adult too, if you're just trying to find your own passion for Canadian history, doesn't matter if the books that you choose to read are intended for adults. You can read really amazing biographies and stories written for adults about Canadian history, but you can also read teen books or kid books just for yourself. Don't feel constricted to having to read a grown-up book just because you're a grown-up. There's some great ways to engage with history through the fiction of all levels. So read them anyway.
No, I've done that. Absolutely. Especially for my one child that was always very sensitive. So I wanted to know, if there was something that we needed to discuss first, sensitive in terms of they would have nightmares over some of the stuff. So a lot of the time I would read the book ahead of time. Sometimes I would just read it because I wanted to, or so we could discuss it. And there's no problem with taking out books that are technically intended for a different age group. So I've done that with lots of the books. Yeah, one other thing that I know has been interesting for us is some of the books, even though maybe you don't read the whole book, maybe it's too boring or just too much information at once, but oftentimes they can have really good pictures. So I know one series that we've enjoyed was the Kids Book of series. So there's the Kids Book of Aboriginal peoples, there's the Kids Book of exploration, the Kids Book of the Canadian Railway. Anyway, they're a whole series of books, and our library has a whole set, and they've got really good artwork in them. Often people are looking as well for a perspective from an Indigenous author for the Indigenous books, and the author of the Kids Book of Aboriginal Peoples is an Indigenous author. We've really enjoyed, maybe not reading every word on all those pages, but actually seeing the beautiful artwork in those books, because kind of brought things alive as well.
And if you're looking for some books to read, we do have a list on the website for historical books for Canadian history. So you can find that. There's an entire list of just about every book we could find. And I'm sure that's still growing since we finished that. Elena finished that. So that was a really great resource if you're trying to find a specific book for a specific time period. So that's helpful. Another idea is to watch documentaries or fiction TV shows or movies. So I know not all documentaries are kid friendly. So for you as a parent, if you're trying to learn more, documentaries could be a great way to kind of get familiar with and see firsthand, wherever possible, different experiences. They often have used the primary sources. If you're not familiar with that term, that just means resources that were actually from the period of time that they're talking about. So it could be old video footage or photos or interviews or journal entries that people are reading out loud or diary entries from the people who are there. I find documentaries really fascinating because they bring us right into the story and hold us there until we can see it for ourselves. I remember I was watching a documentary about the Halifax explosion of 1917. I know I could probably never show it to my kids because, well, honestly, it was quite horrific. There was like buildings blown to smithereens and there are probably bodies sticking out of the rubble. I mean, it's hard to tell because it's old footage, obviously, from the early 1900s isn't like cutting edge 4D technology that we have today, 4K technology that we have today. But it did have obvious signs of death and destruction everywhere. There were just people walking around looking lost. It was really traumatic. And I remember it invoked a lot of emotions in me. And it wasn't just about the date, oh, the Halifax explosion happened on December 1917. It was an event that was real and it was raw and it was painful. So documentaries can be a really great way. Have you personally watched any documentaries about Canadian history that you found really helpful?
Yeah, we have. I seem to remember doing one through the National Film Board that we just accessed for free on the computer. And then we also did some parts of I think it's called Canada, A People's History. Is that the name of it? Anyway, and those, I do find that at first I thought I mean, the one program that I was using said that it was kid friendly after this one scene. And I mean, I guess everybody's definition of kid friendly is different. And I definitely should have pre-screened some of that first, or all of it first, for the age group I was using it with at the time, kind of like the later elementary, middle school. So if you're going to use that, then definitely be warned that there were some things in it that my kids were like, whoa, I wish we hadn't seen that. Or, that's the danger maybe in something that's visual versus just reading about it. A visual can kind of burn an image into your head about it, and that can be important for adults or for older kids and people who can handle that. But I think we need to be aware of that. But they are really well done, and I definitely used that when my oldest did the Canadian history high school credit. She watched quite a lot of those and had no problems with them at that point. There's also, is it the Historica Canada, those minute ones? What are those called? Do you remember?
The Heritage Minutes?
Thank you. Yeah, and is it by Historica Canada? I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we've done some of those as well, and you can access those online. And then sometimes I would just like enter into YouTube whatever I wanted and look to see if there was something there and look at it first and then watch that. I think it's well worth adding things like that into your homeschool as long as you're fully aware that some historical events can be quite traumatic, I guess. Yeah, it's important to make sure that you screen what's appropriate for your own kids at their own age, because every child's different as well.
Yeah, so there's also some really interesting fictional movies and TV shows about Canadian history things. Is it Fly Away Home, the one with the little girl who found the geese and ended up teaching them how to fly? And yeah, so that's a Canadian one that you can watch. But you don't necessarily think, oh, Canadian history, but it does connect Canada into a fictional kind of environment and a movie and that kind of thing. So that's kind of fun. A lot of times fictional movies and TV shows are done for entertainment. And so they can be a little bit exaggerated. You can actually learn a lot from quality fiction shows, though. And at our house, my teams, they've been watching Murdoch Mysteries. Now, Murdoch Mysteries is a TV show that is based on a detective from the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it's like that crossover period. And there's like 15 or 16 seasons of show. Now, I'd say that it's probably not really intended for the 8 and 10-year-old that have decided they need to watch it sometimes as well, because it can be pretty, well, it's a murder mystery and there's things like autopsies and stuff. And sometimes the content might be a little not age appropriate for younger kids, but my teenagers have really been enjoying it. They've been binge watching the whole thing. And it's really interesting to see them, the characters, meet some of the historical characters like the prime ministers of the time period. It's been interesting to see how women's clothing has changed over the show. And it's led to some really interesting conversations like women's rights and about race and even the validity of Murdoch, who's this like genius guy and he invents all these crazy stuff. Or talk about whether his inventions are actually accurate for the time period that they're presented in. Because was there really CCTV in the late 1800s? Well, apparently Murdoch invented it. So it's been a good way to be curious about knowing more and whether that was real or whether that was just something extra. The kids learned about Tesla versus Edison and those kinds of, it's been really cool to see some of the stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't even heard of that, to be honest. Yeah, that's really cool. I think it's also like important to also think about geography when we talk about history, because I mean, the two are often lumped together like social studies, because geography and history, I mean, they're kind of go hand in hand. So if you're looking at somewhere with a historical event, then like in the past, we pulled up different videos on geography type topics, or finding out more about the place and looking at pictures of what it actually looks like, that kind of thing. Yeah, another thing that is interesting too, you're talking about TV show. I remember, now I haven't seen it in a really long time, like the Road to Avonlea series or things like that. I'm sure there's other things out there. The original Anna Green Gables movie. So it's fiction and it's not all going to be super factual. You can get a feel for the time period, or even, I mean, sometimes if you really know your stuff, maybe you could find stuff in shows that, isn't accurate. Like, hey, like, did they really wear stuff like that in that decade or whatever? And I mean, I don't know enough to know exactly how accurate all these fictional stuff is, but I know they try. And yeah, that was a Canadian series that was out. I think it must have been in the 90s. I mean, that's when I was those ages.
All right. So the other thing I was going to say is a great way to kind of enjoy Canadian history is to find something personal for you to discover. So when I was a kid, my mom was a history major, which is funny because I didn't like history. My mom loved Canadian history, but in her collection of things, she had this folder. It's called a jackdaw, which is not the bird, but it's a collection of interesting artifacts that provide information about a particular subject or period or idea, and it kind of helps build background and interest. I looked at this folder like 100 times growing up. It had inside a lot of copies of primary sources. So it had like sample letters. It was all about the fur trade. So it had like sample letters. It had, what are those called? Like accounting forms, like trade out forms.
Yeah.
They had all kinds of stuff. I think there might have even at one point been a small piece of beaver fur. Like there was things in it that you could look at. There was maps. They were all like original. And then they had more recent things like articles and newspaper and stuff like that. But it was really interesting to me as a kid. And I was thinking about it as I keep saying, I hate Canadian history. I realized if I hated Canadian history so much, why did I steal that little folder when I left and kept it with me? I still have it here on my shelf behind me. Like, why was that engaging to me where school wasn't? And I think one of the reasons
Yeah.
is, one, it was because it wasn't telling me that I had to learn a set of dates and explain why it was important. And I didn't have to regurgitate any facts or things to
Yeah.
anybody to prove that I knew something. It was just me learning about something because I wanted to learn it. So that was one thing. Another is when you can have the opportunity to go on field trips to places that represent different periods
Yes.
of time, because that again isn't a let's go on a field trip and I need you to write me 1,000 word essay about why this blah blah blah, right? It's just let's go experience it. So if you go to an Indigenous village and you have an opportunity to see what life was like for them. In Ontario here where I was growing up, the people had long houses and we got to see some of the sister gardening that they do with the squash, corn and beans.
Yeah.
And then you got to learn and experience things like that. Well, that was a really cool experience for me. I got an
Yeah.
opportunity to see firsthand what life was like. Some of my favorite memories of our trips across Canada were visiting places like pioneer villages where people are living off the land like they did in the early 1800s, like churning butter and having oxen pull carts and things like that. That personalization of history, being able to discover history for yourself,
Yeah.
is kind of an awesome way to enjoy history.
Yeah, I know those have been some of our best field trips, is especially the ones that we've gone to. And like we've had to go out of our way. There's nothing like that really close by. But, when we were visiting other people, I'd look something up, be like, oh, what's in that area? Hey, there's this. And the best ones have been the ones that have the people dressed up. Usually they only have that like in the summer months, but some places are open full year. And so they're actually dressed up in character. And like if you ask them like a modern question, they'll look at you funny as, just to keep in character, and it makes the kids laugh. And that has been some of the best ones. We've done the Indigenous longhouse villages. We've done pioneer villages, some of the old forts. There's different ones.
Yes.
I know even like my oldest went and visited with my brother, and he's really into history, so is she. So he took her to some of the other places around where he lived. I really encourage people to go check those things out because they're they're worth it.
We did
Yeah.
Old Fort Henry as a kid. If you're not familiar with that, that's in Kingston. And they dress
Yeah.
in full like British garb. I want to remember even my younger siblings loved it, especially the boys, because they actually shoot cannons and rifles and
Yeah.
do parade drills and stuff. And, you know, they may not remember why, but they were totally fascinated by it because it made a lot of
Yeah.
banging noises. And so it's still, there's lots of ways to find that kind of engaging opportunities when you
Yeah.
get to go places where they reenact stuff.
Yeah, there's even like special historical houses. I'm thinking when I was a kid, it was called Battlefield House, I think. I think it's somewhere near Hamilton, Ontario. And we went there even with school, and that was like specifically really fascinating. I remember another school trip, we got to see like some of the spots that certain historical events happened. Especially if you give kids a bit of the background info first, like not in a boring way, but maybe you read a book tied to it or look at some
Mhm.
videos tied to it and then go. I remember even when we went, my youngest girl was probably about 3 at the time, and we went to see the Crawford Lake Indigenous village. It's actually on the site where it was, but they've rebuilt it. And we had read about it ahead of time, and she just got out of the vehicle and saw it, and her eyes just got big, and she said, "Look at the Palisades!" And it was just neat that she remembered that, and yeah, that was just one of the best trips. So highly
Cool.
recommend that. I think another thing for us that's kind of cool, and it depends obviously where your family background is from. I mean, you can do this for obviously everybody's family background comes from somewhere. But if you've got a background that has to relate to some of the Canadian historical events, it's kind of neat. I know that with topics such as like immigration or for my family, on the one side, I know for sure that we originally came from England, came across to the United States. Then some of the people ended up being part of the United Empire Loyalists. And so you can actually trace it back and how many generations back it goes. And I can specifically trace it back to these two brothers, and one fought for the United States, one for Canada, and the one that fought for the US actually died in the conflict. And then the other one came north to, was it New Brunswick or Nova Scotia? Pretty sure it's Nova Scotia. And then eventually one of his sons moved to another area in Ontario, which is where, my dad's family is all from. So it's kind of just neat if you can actually connect it to family history. Somehow you can do a lot of research into that if you don't have that information. But oftentimes if you ask, aunts, uncles, grandparents, parents, whoever, somebody might have more info than what, your own family does, and get that connected. But things like ancestry.ca, a lot of the times the library has information. I know my mom has been trying to do her family history, and the library has been a huge help. They have like a speaker come in once in a while from somewhere else, and she goes to those, and they have like help. So it might be a neat project for older kids to look into that if you don't have that info. And even just like old photos are kind of neat. Or if you have a person in your life that, I remember growing up. So my grandma was born in 1919, and she used to tell me stories about, having the milk delivered to her house. And at the house that she lived in had the actual little door in the kitchen that you could open from the inside, and they'd have put the milk in there. Or just different stories that are connected because they happen to people take advantage of that. My grandma's gone now, but there's other older people that might just have a different experience than you, maybe growing up in the Great Depression. Or I know we asked my next door neighbor all about his immigration experience. He came over from Europe as a boy and coming across on the ship, and settling in Canada, and what was that like? And he didn't speak the language. And so having those kinds of experiences too. In terms of studying, your own family's immigration experience, if you had immigration in your background or maybe friends or family, I wrote a whole post on the website called Exciting Ideas for Studying Canadian Immigration in Your Homeschool. And it goes through some different books, nonfiction and fiction, and some hands-on projects. We really enjoyed doing that when we did Canadian history, because actually learning about people in our life, our family background, like I said, or people like my next door neighbor or friends that, hearing about their stories and how that relates to Canadian history. So that was pretty cool. And lastly, another thing that I found really interesting for my kids, kind of like your folder that you got from your mom, was we once went to, or I guess we've been twice now, to a coin and stamp show. And you can get whole bundles of stamps. They had whole bags of stamps that were just Canadian stamps. And oftentimes the Canadian stamps have historical tie-in. So maybe they'll have, some historical event that happened. I remember there was one stamp that got my kids interested in, well, what does that mean? And it was specifically about an explorer, or, they how do you say it, commemorate certain famous people, and then you can learn about, okay, well, why are they famous? You could even look at, bills, like why is this historical figure on the bill, that kind of thing. And then also just looking at old coins, it was really, really cool. They had a whole bunch of old pennies, like the big pennies that are like, I don't know, probably a little bit bigger than a toonie. And we had to look at those, and they had ones that were from before Canada was the way it is today. So they had the old coins that were silver coins. You can see, and then you could discuss why coins were made of silver, why they're not now, when they changed it. You can discuss a lot of the coins have historical events or geography stuff right on them, the special coins. You can talk about, why they stopped producing a penny. Like that's part of Canadian history. And my one daughter collects pennies, so she always goes to the coin shows and grabs as many as she can. And yeah, we came across this man that was selling these old pennies. He had a giant bin of them, and they're like a bit bigger than a toonie. And anyway, they're really cool because a lot of the pennies, some of them had stuff about Upper Canada written on them. Some of them were from before all the provinces joined Canada. So there was specific coins for specific provinces. So we ended up buying a bunch of those. And it just makes it more, I don't know, almost like more believable that it actually happened. Of course it did, but having that penny, and then my kids were like, wow, like somebody from that time period used this. And then like, how much would that be worth compared to today? Because they're like, why? And my one daughter bought this penny that is quite worn out. Like it's just, you can barely read the writing on it. And the man at the coin show was like, that's like worth nothing. She's like, well, it's worth a lot to me. And it had a hole drilled in it. So then he told her that perhaps the person that owned it actually had it on like a necklace around their neck, like to keep it safe. Now, who knows? But it's interesting to kind of, theorize about why it had the hole and why it was so worn out. And yeah, so it's really neat just to kind of put a hands-on real connection to history that way. And it brought up discussions about when the different provinces joined Canada and why, and all those kinds of things. If you can get your hands on actual items from the past, perhaps your family has some antiques, or perhaps you can go to an antique shop, or perhaps somebody owns some things that you could actually have a look at and examine and discuss, why it was made that way and why now it's not, or whatever the conversation leads to. It's a pretty neat way of connecting it to Canadian history and making it engaging.
In the last 5 years or so, my family moved to a new town, and it's a little tiny town. And when we first came here, I thought it was really important for us to kind of get to know the town a little bit more. Now, we live in a tiny place, probably no more than 2,000 people. So I sent my older kids, who at the time were probably closer to like early teens as opposed to late teens that they are now. But I asked them to do some research to learn more about the town for me so that we could study them together. And so they did things like go onto Google Maps and they scroll back as far as they can through the historical data. I think Google Earth has the historical data options where you can scroll back and see what things have changed over time. So we went back as far as we could. Now, of course, that's only since Google's been around, whenever technology has allowed the satellite dishes to be, but it's been interesting to see some, so we can see how it changed and how it's grown over the years. So that was kind of a really cool experience. But we can also, with the overhead satellite view, be able to see things like where an old railroad train used to be able to go through. And so it's not a train anymore. It's been decommissioned and the rails are gone, but it's actually a walking trail now. But it allowed my kids to have the opportunity to see, why is that there? What is that? And so we took some time and we learned more about the train and why it was up here and when it ran and when it stopped working. That was kind of neat. There's also a historical buildings throughout the town. So there's a beautiful old big white building, and it has a date on it. I can't remember what the date is anymore. We researched what that building was. When was it built? Why was it there? It used to be an old like hotel. So when people came in on the train, they could, have a place to sleep for the night. So that was kind of an interesting experience as well. And checking out, if you live in a smaller town in particular, they often have historical centers like museums. They're mostly like one room buildings. They're not giant, huge historical centers, but a lot of times they often have really interesting artifacts specific to your area that they, if you live in a farm area, there's a lot of farm things like that are really interesting to tie into the town, which you may not have thought about before. For us also in our town, we have a fall fair every year, which is a pretty common thing when you live in rural particularly, but the fall fair has been around for like 100 years or something. And so they often have pictures of the different fairs over the years. So that's kind of cool to watch too. And I know that one of the things that people are really proud of at the fair that where we live is they have tractor donations from some of the old farmers in town and some of the antique tractors. So we've been able to see how tractors have changed over time. So that's been really cool for our kids too. Because we're used to the big, huge honking tractors with the massive wheels and the cabins and all kinds of stuff. But no, they are like little old putt-putt kind of tractors, and off they did building the farms that they built. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. So
Yeah, I think it's important to be aware of what's going on in your community and how that could connect to your homeschool. So whether that's, looking to see what's available at your library in terms of, events or special speakers they have, or books, or I know like our library has a thing you can go back and look at all old newspapers, whatever it is, or whether that's, a museum or like you said, a fair or whatever it is. These are all things that you wouldn't necessarily think right away. Oh, a coin and stamp show that relates to homeschooling. But then when you actually think about it, it does. Same with, fall fair, and not just to history, even there's so many other opportunities involved in those things that, so to speak, check off certain boxes educationally. Not that you need to check off any boxes, but just there's so many learning opportunities with those things right in your own town. I know sometimes like when we've been out places, my kids are like, what's that? And, it's a historical plaque. And then you can read, what's on the historical plaque and then have a bigger discussion about, what was there. There's a spot that we've seen that, used to have a key place for the fur trades. And we, discussed about, okay, why would that have been here? And, why would that be a good location for this? And what happened here and all those kinds of things. So yeah, there's so many opportunities if you go out and look for it.
yeah, and I think if we as adults are good role models in our study of history or our excitement about history, we don't have to fall prey to that whole that history has to be from a textbook or from a specific path or plan. History is everywhere all the time. We just have to find the different parts for it. My advice is just to be excited and inspire curiosity for our kids by being excited ourselves, because if we're excited to learn, they will too. You were talking about ancestry and stuff, and I was thinking about how important it is for us to learn about people, because kids want to know about the people who experienced those moments in history. They don't really care about the big moment of history. They want to zoom in really close and see how they were different or how are they the same as those people. They want to imagine themselves in those person's shoes and relate to those experiences. So it's a great reason to study history. My daughter, who is about to be 9, she says last night in the car, "Oh, I was always really thinking I would love to know how people who lived before me in our family actually lived." I'm like,
that's cool.
Okay, guess it's time to study history. Anyway, so yeah, I think making it personal and connecting it in somehow. I know I did a family tree for my father-in-law a couple of years ago for Christmas. I'm adopted, so personal family history is a bit of a struggle for me, because although I absolutely 100% am part of and love my adopted family, there's always been that kind of disconnect between, is their family history the same as my family history? Like there's this kind of juxtaposition. So family history heritage stuff in school was always really tricky for me because I didn't really know how I fit into the big picture. But it's really cool for me to be able to go to my husband's family and be able to backtrack that for their family and do all the ancestries for them. So it's been really cool. And we learned all about how they were in Scotland. And there's actually somebody moved not that far away from where we live in about the, late 1800s. We can go look at the place where he had a farm, although it's probably, covered over in houses now. But we can also go to the local library because they have records there where you can see people's signatures and find the actual proof that the person lived in that place at that time. And I know my adopted family have heritage roots in Germany, so it's really cool to be able to see their history and ancestry. And my grandmother was a nurse during the World Wars, and so we have pictures of her in her nursing outfits from those periods. Those kinds of things are really cool, and if you can show them to your kids and connect it for them, that's really helpful. I loved that conversation too.
I know too, you have a post, I think it was written quite a while ago, called Ideas to Study Your Family History. And there's quite a few hands-on ideas on there, as well as a freebie that you can print out, My Family, a Simple Genealogy Research Project. And it does have a sheet on adoption as well. So kind of a neat way if you're looking for something to actually download for free and use in your pursuit of learning about your family history. That's there available as well.
One of the really important things for history is that as we've been mentioning through this entire thing, is that there's so many and different opportunities for learning. It's not just what you're tempted to default to. It doesn't have to be a textbook and a video or whatever thing. It can be all kinds of stuff. So don't be afraid to think outside the textbook. Make something, craft something, draw something, bake something, write something, go somewhere, talk to someone, reenact something, play a game. I know of somebody who even turned their house into like a mini museum, which I think is totally amazing. And I'm totally tempted to borrow that idea, although my husband may disagree with me, because I think it'd be really cool to set up little exhibits of different periods of history in Canadian history as you walk through the house and you make it through the timeline. I thought that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
cool. I wonder too if you could even like do that as part of a homeschool group, like get a couple friends together and do it. Maybe even rent a room somewhere. Like I know our library rents rooms or whatever, and different people could bring things. Like for example, I have those old stamps or old coins. Maybe somebody else has something else. Who knows? Yeah, that would be a cool idea.
I am a huge believer in hands-on learning, especially since my kids weren't the kids that sat down and listened to me read books particularly well, but they did really great when I would give them projects and activities to do. So on my website, I have 31 days of hands-on history. There is a series on there. We did things like tried to make a blue nose out of Lego and see if it would float. Let me warn you, Lego is really tricky to float. We did things like discovering how the St. Lawrence Seaway works, because they had over, in the 1940s or whatever it was, they had to readjust the St. Lawrence Seaway so that ships could get through. We did things like make a Brody hat, which is the World War, the helmets that they would wear. We did a victory garden. We did all kinds of stuff. Hands-on history is one of my favorite ways to learn. And then I also have my Canadian time capsule, which is like a deeper dive into different periods of history. If you've ever had the opportunity to pan for gold, that sounds like a lot of fun. I've only ever done it with play gold in my backyard and a water table and sand, but it's still, and a really fancy pie plate that had holes in the bottom, but it's still the same idea, right? It's just, even if you give your kids an opportunity to experience that's really cool. And then if you get really good at it, maybe you can go out into the actual stream and see what you can find. But there's all kinds of different things. And my Canadian time capsule is all about 12 different moments of Canadian history where you get to zoom in and do activities. You get to tie in things like the book reading and mapping and web questing, where you have to research a project or answer a question or decide if you're going to become a voyager or whatever. There's different things for every unit. There's food depending on the topic. My goal was to make it engaging and fun, because I know I love hands-on learning, and so do my kids. So that was the whole purpose of that program. So if you're looking for hands-on ways to study Canadian history, that's where that one came from. I'm a big fan of things like dioramas, although I don't really like having them all over my house forever and ever. I think it's a lot of fun to create them and have kids discuss what's important and not important to include in them. So that's always fun.
With the bigger projects, I know through the years, we've kept them for a while, and then we take pictures and be like, okay, it's time for this to go so we can make room for other things. Especially we don't live in a very big house. So, take a picture and then we can still have it that way. Yeah, something did come to mind when you were speaking too, that we did a lot of, my one child in particular was into art. And so as we were reading, then we would often have them draw while I was reading or after I was done reading, kind of like kind of like a reading response, in the sense of, draw something that we talked about. So, we made a whole duotang full of artwork to do with Canadian history at one point. All sorts of whatever we were learning about, they did some drawings for that. And that was kind of a neat way to do things. Another cool thing was timeline. So we actually used the timeline on the website that's available for purchase and, colored it. And we ended up making it kind of taping it together so it could also be folded up and then put up on the wall. And then I know once we did that, then my oldest kind of walked us through the timeline, the things she could remember and wanted to talk about.
Well, cool. I think that we've covered a lot of really interesting and engaging ways to help our kids love Canadian history, and hopefully even us, like people like me who think they don't like Canadian history, but just need to realize that there's more than they might have thought, because it's not just the textbooks and dates and facts that we were taught in school. So
all right. Well, thanks for joining us today as we discussed ways to make Canadian history more interesting for our learners and for ourselves. And I hope you got lots of great ideas.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. We hope you are encouraged to dive more into Canadian history for yourself and with your kids. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the challenges of homeschooling multiple kids, especially when there are varying learning needs. So if you have any feedback, ideas for topics, or people we should try to connect with for interviews, please let us know. And don't forget to share with your homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.